I'm going to be talking about neurobiology, which basically means our brains and how our brains work. There are a lot of books, there are lots of videos about it. And I think that one of the things that I like to do, though, um, is to sort of explain science so that we all get to understand it and use it. It's been one of my passions throughout my life to be able to translate science into terms that the rest of us non-scientists can use. So when it comes to neurobiology, I'll start first with just how does the body work? We hear words like nerves and nervous system and all of that stuff, but let's just say that I touch my finger here. And when I do that, there's a nerve cell in my finger, and it has a fiber that's attached to it. And that fiber runs up my finger and up into my spinal cord, wraps around a couple of other fibers, and it goes up into a part of my brain that registers touch. So I instantly know that I've touched something. Now, that doesn't exactly seem like a big deal, but knowing where our bodies are in space is a really big deal. Knowing, you've probably gotten in a hurry sometime and went to walk out of a door and hit the door. So your body wasn't ready. Your body wasn't getting little clues about how to position itself. So these touch nerve cells are what helps us do that. It helps us navigate. You think about a cat. The whiskers that a cat has have an enormous number of nerve cells attached to them so that they can maneuver in between places. So being able to move around in the world without injuring ourselves, it's really important to be able to have these senses of touch. So if I do that again, but I press harder, there's a different nerve cell in there that's also getting stimulated. And it's sending an electrical current up a different fiber, up into my spinal cord, up into a part of my brain that registers pressure. So now I know two things. I know that I'm touching something, and I know that it's not that solid. It's not that hard. But now if I just kind of reach back and touch something, or I touch my watch, here we go, touch my watch. Now there's another fiber that's getting stimulated, and it's sending an electrical current up its own fiber, up into my spinal cord and into a part of my brain that registers temperature. So now I know that I'm touching something. I know that it's not a real heavy duty touch, and I know that whatever I'm touching is cooler than the air around me. So it's all pieces of information that are instantaneously getting registered in my brain. And now if I kind of dig my nail into my finger, there's still another different kind of nerve cell that's getting stimulated. And it sends an electrical current up its own pathway into the spinal cord and up to a part of my brain that registers pain. And within a nanosecond, when my brain gets stimulated and recognizes pain, there's this other message that comes down, an electrical current that comes down from my brain into the bicep muscle of my arm, and it tells me to pull away. Well, actually, I'm using the wrong arm here. So if I'm doing this and I'm in pain, oh yeah, it's this arm. It pulls it away. So it tells my muscle to contract. And all of this happens in, millimeters of seconds. So when you think about how many sensations you're experiencing right now, so notice your feet on the ground. If you're sitting down, notice the backs of your legs on the chair. Notice where your elbows are on the chair. So in every moment that we're living, we're getting hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these little stimulations that are creating electrical currents that are sending information to our brain. So that's a really dumbed down version. It's my best dumbed down version of how a nervous system works. So now I'm just going to talk about the brain and neurobiology. So in neurobiology, one of the really important things is that we have this combination of electrical energy and chemical energy. We have that in the rest of our bodies as well, but in the brain, it's a really big deal. It's an enormous part of how things interact in the brain. And one of the things I also like to learn about is evolutionary neurobiology. It's like, why did our brains develop the way they are? And why would they use a process that's pretty cumbersome, that combines electrical energy and chemical energy and all different kinds of chemicals? You know, in terms of the amount of energy that takes, why would our brains have developed in that way? Certainly there are easier ways for information to get around in our brain. There's a few different theories. The one that I like, the one that I find interesting, is that that the chemicals that are in our brain were way back when in human history, when people were nomadic and were often having very little to eat at different times. They would eat plants, whatever they found along the way. Many of the medicinal plants that we now know of have psychoactive properties. But there's some thought that people who were able to use organic matter, chemicals, to help their brain, literally to feed their brain, were more likely to have evolved. I have no idea, how true that is, but it makes sense as to partly why we would have evolved such a complicated brain, and also the types of chemicals that are in our brain. Turns out they're exactly the same kind of chemicals that are present in drugs, that we call recreational drugs. So there's no drug out there in the world that doesn't have its own naturally occurring drug in our brain. And that's why it works so well, because they're cousins. So in our brain, the electrical and the chemical experiences happen also just in the speed of light. So an electrical impulse comes into the brain, and it stimulates this nerve cell. It's called a neuron. It stimulates the nerve cell, and information comes in through certain kinds of fibers and goes out generally through one longer one. When that electrical impulse comes into the cell, goes through it and comes out the other end, then there's this gap. There's a gap between that fiber and the next cell. And there aren't a lot of words that are really important to memorize for our purposes, but this is one of them. It's the synapse. That gap between one part of a cell and a different cell is called the synapse. And that's where all of a sudden that electrical charge releases chemicals into that synapse. And those chemicals then are sort of swim across this microscopic space and dock on to receptors on the other cell. And they do it in what's called a lock and key mechanism, so that they're like this. If one molecule is shaped like this, the receptor's shaped like that. So they dock on. And once that happens, they stimulate more chemical reactions in that cell. So there's a series, it's sort of a cascade of chemical events that happens within the cell, and the result of which is one reason why I didn't go to medical school, because I didn't do so well with organic chemistry. So I can't tell you what all of these chemical reactions are, but I can tell you that the result is very similar to what we see in a battery. The chemical reactions are generating positive and negative charges. And just like with a battery, positive and negative end, you connect those things and bam, you've got an electrical current. And that's what's happening in the brain. That series of chemical reactions causes a buildup of positive and negative charges, which then result in another electrical impulse. So you've got an electrical impulse and then a synapse where chemicals are floating through, docking on to the other part of the receptors on another cell, creating this whole bunch of chemical reactions, and all of a sudden you've got another electrical impulse. And this just happens over and over and over again. And once that happens, the chemicals come undocked. They've done their job. And so they undock, and they're floating around in the synapse, the gap again. And then there's a process that I think of as a little red wagon. And a little red wagon that comes in, and it starts just kind of moving around in the synapse, and it picks up all of these chemicals. And the little red wagon takes them back to the mothership, if you will, or back to the original cell, and repackages them. It's our brain's way of recycling chemicals. It's actually called a reuptake process. And this is one of the ways that our brain manages to keep us fully stocked with the chemicals that we need without overburdening itself by having to manufacture new ones over and over and over again. So the recycling, or the reuptake as it's called, is a really important part of our brain's conservation of energy. So I keep talking about chemicals, and there are, there's not millions, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of different neurobiological chemicals in our brains. There are a few that are really important, though, for understanding both emotions, some mental disorders, and the effects of drugs. And the first one of those chemicals is dopamine. The other thing about these cells and the chemicals is that they tend to live in different parts of the brain. I like to think of it as neighborhoods. You know, that there's different neighborhoods in the brain, and a lot of certain chemicals are in that part of the brain as opposed to other parts of the brain. There's lots of great information out there, lots of great pictures and videos that will actually will map the brain and show you exactly where the chemicals are and what that part of the brain is doing. That's not really necessary for understanding about the reactions of drugs in the brain, but they're really kind of cool to watch. So the first chemical is dopamine. And dopamine is often referred to as the pleasure chemical. But it's present in a number of different parts of the brain. It's present in a part of the brain that helps to control voluntary muscle movements. And if you damage that part of the brain, you have Parkinson's disease, which is a disease of muscle movements. So if you dramatically decrease dopamine, you end up with Parkinson's disease. But in another part of the brain, dopamine is related to the experience of pleasure. And it's also located in that part of the brain that we think of as the survival part of the brain. The part that keeps us going, keeps us alive, keeps us noticing what's going on in the environment. And so what happens when you do something that releases dopamine into the pleasure center, it signals to the survival center, that feels good, do it again. That feels good. This is necessary to live. Keep doing that. So when we engage in certain behaviors, if we drink when we're thirsty, if we eat when we're hungry, when we have sex, although I tend to think only good sex counts, I'm not sure that bad sex counts, but with any of those behaviors that help guarantee the survival of the species, any of those behaviors release dopamine into the pleasure center of the brain. And the experience that we get is, wow, that feels good, do it again. That feels good, do it again. Every drug that we have out there in the world, every recreational drug that we have out there in the world, the very first thing it does when it gets into our brain is it releases dopamine into the pleasure center. So the absolutely natural human response to drugs is to go, that feels good, do it again. So if all of us have that pleasure response to drugs, then why aren't we all doing them all the time? And why do some people get in trouble and some people don't? And that's a longer story for another video. But it is important to realize that the pleasure and the reinforcement that comes from drug use is a natural biological function. And it's tied to what our brains feel as a survival mechanism. So it's not some weird out-of-body experience. It's something that our brains recognize. And that in general is not damaging to our brains, because it's the same chemicals that are already in there. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but in general, these are not chemicals that are in and of themselves toxic. So that's dopamine. So all drugs, the first thing they do is release dopamine. Another important neurochemical is norepinephrine. And what I like to say is whenever you see a chemical name that starts with NOR, you can just kind of cross that out because it makes it harder to say when it's longer. A real chemist would just, scream to hear me say that. But if you cut off that NOR, what you've got is epinephrine. Just a little easier to say. But then when you think about the fact that for some reason scientists get a real kick out of naming things different depending on where they are in the body. So in your brain, there's this chemical called epinephrine or norepinephrine. It's exactly the same chemical that's in your body that's called adrenaline. And a lot of us have heard of the word adrenaline. It's like that's the adrenaline. We got our adrenaline going. So it's exactly the same chemical in the brain, and it has pretty much that effect. It's an activating chemical. It increases the transmission of impulses. It's related to mood, to energy, and it's also part of what we call the human stress response, or the fight-flight response. So I was talking about dopamine in the survival center of the brain. This is where fight-flight is located. This is where when we sense danger, our bodies and our brains respond. So if I'm walking down the street, I'm getting ready to cross the corner, I'm in the crosswalk and I've got the green light and I step off the curb and somebody comes right past and almost hits me with the car. I do what pretty much every human being would do, is that I jump back and I take a big intake of breath. My eyes get really big. My heart starts beating. I start breathing faster. My hands get kind of clammy. My stomach is not so hot. So these are the reactions of the impulse, the visual danger coming into my brain, and my brain pouring out epinephrine, pouring it out into the synapses, which signals my adrenal glands to pour out adrenaline into my entire body. So my brain starts it, and then the rest of my body picks it up. And what's happened is that it's increased my respiration, increased my heartbeat, so I can get enough oxygen in my blood. It dilates my pupils, makes them bigger so I can see the danger and see possible things to get away from it. And it takes the blood supply away from my intestines because I don't really need to be digesting my donut right now. And it takes that blood supply and it puts it both into my brain, but it also puts it into the major muscles of my legs and my butt so I can run. And that happens in an instant of the perception of danger. The drugs that are related to norepinephrine are the stimulants. The stimulants that raise blood pressure, that increase mood, that give you a great sense of energy and well-being, that dilate the pupils. Those are the drugs that are releasing norepinephrine into the brain.